I think we will start. We are not so many, but if people join, Paula, you will let them come. So welcome. Today we will hear about Michel Hübel's work. Just before to begin, some housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic when you are not speaking. You can raise your hand or use the chat to ask questions or make comments. So this is the ECOP Wednesday. It's part of the ECOP network's activities. Our networks aims at linking policy and science for the early careers. And if you want to join, you can check the link at the end of this slide, or follow us on the social networks. So today we will hear the work on Michel. So Michel is an early career in marine ecology, fisheries, and seafood sustainability. And she recently completed a master degree in biological oceanography from Guiomar, and she's involved in various projects linking social systems and fisheries ecology. Today, she will talk about social ecological network modeling of fish invasions in the Panama Canal, and this is actually her master thesis presentation. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and Michel, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. Let's see. Oh, I lost my presentation.
While you are checking your presentation, I can add that she's in California right now. So please be grateful that she woke up early this morning to give this presentation.
And thank you all three of you for being here. It's less pressure on me, so I'm excited to present this to you guys. Can you see the presentation okay?
Yes, it's fine.
You can see the screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as Rowan mentioned, this is my master thesis on the topic was creating a social ecological network model of recent fish invasion events in the Panama Canal. So around this time last year, I was in Panama conducting the fieldwork for this research. And so I'll just go over a little bit about the canal, the state of the art of social ecological network modeling, some of the methods used to collect the data in the field, the results that were found, and then the conclusions we can draw from those and some future outlook. So this work was conducted in Panama between Central and South America, just this little bit of land right there. And the canal was opened in 1914. It's vitally important for the global economy, as well as the regional economy. The canal is, as opposed to being at sea level, it's not at sea level canal, so it is separated by a freshwater lake that runs through the Isthmus of Panama. That's called Gatun Lake. That lake is both a place of residence for many, many people, as well as a crucial source of drinking water for the region. So there was a canal expansion project that took place that ended in 2016 to allow for larger Neo-Panamax vessels to pass through the canal. So if you guys heard about this bridge that collapsed in, I think it was Baltimore, it was a city recently where a huge cargo ship collided with a bridge. That was the scale of ships that were allowing to be passed through the canal by this new expansion. So these like super large ships. So a new set of locks was added to the canal, as you can see in the figure on the left, and as well as this enormous freshwater lake that constitutes the passage through which ships pass through the canal was also further excavated, so deepened, widened to allow for larger ships to pass through. Since that expansion project, there's been a nearly 30% increase in the presence of marine species in this freshwater lake post-expansion. And then there's also been an increase in the salinity of the lake, so a potential break in the biological barrier between the two, the Atlantic and the Pacific sides of the canal. So there's a long history of fishing in Gatun Lake inside the canal. There's both a long history of sport fishing, one of what they claim to be the world's oldest sport fishing club, as well as thousands of artisanal fishers who fish there for their own sustenance or that of their families or communities, as well as to sell for profit. And peacock bass have been the main target species since their introduction into the system in the 1970s. So those are also a non-native species that were introduced from South America. And I'll introduce a little bit what are social ecological networks. So it's an offshoot of network science applied to ecology, but adding a social aspect to ecological analyses. So this type of analysis has been growing in popularity in recent years. It's relatively novel, and it's an important framework to understand how ecological systems function in conjunction with human communities. So in this figure on the right, you can see kind of a basic social ecological network. The red circles are social nodes representing different social entities. Those are connected by social links. Then the green circles are ecological nodes connected by ecological links. And then the blue lines that say SE are social ecological links. So any type of link between the social dimension and the ecological dimension. And then this can really be framed in a wide variety of ways. So I'll go into this a little bit further with the state of the art. There are different levels of integration of social ecological networks. The one that's relevant for this project and for most recent social ecological network analyses is type 3. And type 3 integration basically just refers to the fact that all, like both the social dimension, the ecological dimension, as well as the links within those dimensions and between them are all represented. So as you can see from the figure on the left, there's this type of analysis has been growing in popularity, but only in very recent times, especially in the context of fisheries ecology. It's been a really popular method of analysis. The challenge with type 3 integration, so representing all these types of dimensions and links, is that it requires a large amount of data for accuracy and as well as high conceptual effort. So in order to represent things in the sociological realm, oftentimes that kind of data is qualitative versus in the ecological realm, data is oftentimes quantitative. So it can be complicated and complex to kind of put those things all into one network and then analyze them. So these are some of the network parameters that are going to be relevant to the outcome of this project. Starting from the left, there's network density. This refers just to the actual connections that do exist within the network as a ratio to the potential connections that could exist. So with a max ratio of 1, if the network density were 1, that would mean that all the possible connections within the network are really present in the network. And then, of course, a network density of 0 would mean that it's not a network at all. There's no connection. And then in the middle, we have network diameter. This simply refers to the shortest, longest path in the network. So the shortest path between the two nodes that are furthest apart within the network. On the top right-hand side there, we have dominator trees. Dominator trees are an offshoot of a network that basically depict the necessary paths of flow of whatever that network is depicting. So for example, in these two figures on the top right, if those were to represent flow of biomass within a network, we could say that nodes B, C, and D are reliant only on node A for biomass flow. So if node A wasn't present in the network, nodes B, C, and D wouldn't receive that biomass flow. And that relationship we would define as a dominator relationship. So node A dominates those other nodes directly. And that doesn't have to just apply to biomass flow. It can apply to any type of flows within the network. And then on the bottom right, finally, we have a degree centrality or node degrees. And this just refers to the number of nodes that a particular node is directly connected to. So for example, this 0 node in the bottom left, that one is not connected to any other node, so it has a degree centrality of 0, whereas the 2 next to it, that node has a degree centrality of 2 because it's connected directly to 2 other nodes. I'll talk a little bit about some of the methods that were conducted in the field to collect this data. So to collect sociological data, I conducted over 50 interviews with key experts and with fishers to collect relevant information. So the fisher interviews I conducted along with a Panamanian biologist. So we spoke to both artisanal and recreational fishers at different fishing locations around this freshwater lake in the canal. Those are shown in the figure on the right. And these were semi-structured informal interviews that covered these points: years of experience, type of gear used, what was being fished, how have catches changed, has gear choice changed, do you catch to sell or to eat, or do you take people out to fish, which would be considered recreational fishing. In the case of fishers who were selling their fish, who were they selling them to? What happened to the fish after sale, or how did it reach the final consumer? Which fish are kept to eat and which are sold? Have buyers changed? Has income from fish sales changed? And in the case of recreational fishers, where do their clientele come from? Do they rely mostly on domestic clientele or foreign clientele? And then I also conducted several key expert interviews with fish resellers, historians. The project was conducted in conjunction with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which is a longstanding marine and tropical biology research institute in the region. So there are some biologists and ecologists there who have decades of knowledge of the system. I conducted key expert interviews with them as well as regulatory agency representatives. After collecting all of this data, this was the tedious part of recording all the interviews or transcribing all the recordings of the interviews, identifying the key points in each of those interviews, categorizing them, and putting them into a master Excel sheet to create the framework for the networks that I was going to build. So the goal of the project was to build 2 networks, one for pre-canal expansion and one for post-canal expansion, and to determine how those 2 social ecological networks had changed, how they were different from one another between the beginning of the expansion project to the end. And then it was time to conceptualize the network. So to define what exactly the social nodes would represent, the ecological nodes would represent, and what the connections between those would represent. So this is on the right, just a sample of how visually I decided to portray the network. So the social nodes are in pink. The size is not to scale, so not representative of the relative size of each group. And then the fisher nodes are in either purple for recreational fishers, blue for artisanal fishers, or purple-blue for both. So there were some fishers who did practice both artisanal and recreational fishing. Each node size in the case of fisher nodes is representative of individual fishers. And then the ecological nodes are in green, and in the case of ecological nodes as well, the size is not to scale. And only the fish species that were directly fished or mentioned by fishers in interviews as being directly fished were represented for simplicity's sake in the network. The black edges, so at the top in this figure here, between Panama City supermarkets and some of the fisher nodes, those black edges represent monetary flow. The yellow edges represent biomass flow. So you can see those from the ecological nodes to the fishers, i.e. the fishers are fishing the fish, and then the biomass flow goes from fish to fisher. And then red edges represent biomass flow within the ecological realm, so prey to predator. And so this is a quote from one of the fishers that was interviewed. That's representative of a lot of the responses that we received during the interview process. He said, yes, our income from fishing has changed a lot. Now it is that the sales have decreased. We are not catching enough to sell like that in those quantities. So many fishers reported not being able to catch the same volume of fish that they had previously, and that was affecting their income from fishing. So the hypothesis before conducting this project was a quite complex chain of events that we hypothesized to have taken place. So canal expansion leading to the entry of non-native marine fish species, alterations in the ecosystem structure, fishers no longer being able to catch the same volume of fish as a result, a loss of income from artisanal fishing, and then from that a mass switch among fishers from artisanal to recreational fishing. So these initial changes did take place: canal expansion, entry of non-native species. The ecosystem, we assume, was altered in some way, although as of yet, since it was less than a decade ago that this expansion project took place, it's still underdocumented, the ways in which this ecosystem has been altered, new competition or predation or trophic relationships. And then, as I said, fishers widely reported not being able to catch the same volume of fish, also widely reported a loss of income, but there was not a mass switch among fishers from artisanal to recreational fishing. Here's another quote from another fisher that was also representative of a lot of what we were hearing. He said, here the fish is decreasing because of the problem of the jacks. This is the biggest pest here, the jack, because there are some very large schools and the people can't fish them because they don't bite. So the jacks were or are a marine fish species that was entering the lake after the expansion project was entering the lake in very large numbers, reproducing very rapidly, and they're very voracious predators. So they were, according to the fishers, although this is undocumented as of yet in biological data, according to the fishers who were diving in this ecosystem every day, the jacks were consuming peacock bass and other target species and were difficult to fish for sustenance themselves. So we could tell that there were some major ecosystem changes taking place, although my project wasn't focused necessarily on documenting specifically what those ecosystem changes were. And yeah, as I said, there's still a lack of data to really determine exactly what kind of new trophic relationships or new niches are opening up within the ecosystem. But all of this to say that the network, as a result, the post-expansion network, I found to be less connected with less diverse income sources for fishers and decreased network resiliency. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So this is a depiction of the pre-expansion network from about 2000 to 2008 was the time period I chose to frame it in. And then this is the post-expansion network. So 2016, after the completion of the expansion project, to present. And I know there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of colors, a lot of links, but some major takeaways to notice are in the social realm of the network. You can see from pre to post expansion, a lot of connections are lost. And I'll speak later on about why that is. And then we can see in the ecological realm of the network, the addition of some new marine fish species into the system, as well as the addition of some predator-prey trophic relationships. And we can also see that there was not, as was hypothesized, a major switch among fishers from purple to, or excuse me, from blue to purple, from artisanal to recreational. So these were some of the network parameters that were analyzed and the results that we got from them. Left figure 1 is comparing in degrees for monetary flows for fissures. So what that basically represents is the number of income sources for each fissure. And we can see that that decreased from pre to post expansion. And on the right-hand side, we see out degrees of different fish species. So these are all the targeted fish species in the network, and their out degrees pre and post expansion, meaning the number of fissures that reported targeting those species. And we can see that these kind of remain pretty consistent between pre and post expansion, except for the two on the right, weak fish and needlefish, which were both fish that newly had entered the system post expansion. They weren't present before the expansion project. We can also see an important point is that we can also see that peacock bass are the species that were most popularly fished, most targeted by far, both pre and post expansion. So peacock bass are very clearly an important species for the system as a whole. This figure just shows ratios of social ecological in degrees to social in degrees of all fissures. So what that basically is a proxy for is the ratio of target species to income sources for each individual fissure. And this figure breaks it up by different communities because different fishing communities that we interviewed and visited had different targets. Some of them were more artisanal, which are more on the left-hand side. The two on the right-hand side, Gamboa and La Represa, are both communities that were heavily recreational. So for this ratio, the ratio of target species to income sources, a number closer to 1 would be an equal number of target species to income sources, and a number greater than 1 would indicate a larger diversity of species targeted and a lower diversity of income sources. So we can see first off that from pre to post expansion, the post expansion in orange, those ratios, some of them included 0. So some of those fishers no longer had any income sources from selling their fish. We can also see that for several of the different communities, the ratio increased post-expansion, which indicates that they still had or reflects that they still had the prior diversity of fish that they were targeting, but had lost some income sources. So that ratio increased post-expansion. And then for the two fishing communities on the right-hand side of the figure that are more recreational, we can see that those already had a high ratio pre-expansion of targeted fish species to income sources because they only have one income source, and that's one or two, that's from domestic and or foreign tourism. So these are the dominator trees that were constructed for the network. These two here represent biomass flow dominator trees. On the left is pre-expansion and on the right is post-expansion. So again, dominator trees represent the necessary paths of flow of biomass within the network. And what's really important to note here, the takeaway is that peacock bass, once again, is the only species that directly dominates specific fissure nodes. So it's the only species upon which some fishers are solely reliant for their fishing, for their catch from fishing. Some fishers only targeted peacock bass. So it just goes to show the importance of peacock bass to this fishing community. These are monetary flow dominator trees, so showing monetary flow within the network. On the left is pre-expansion, on the right is post. And the important takeaway from these figures is that the number of nodes that are directly dominated by only one income source increases greatly from pre to post expansion. So quite a few more fishers only have one income source. And it's important to note also that these dominator trees don't represent the fishers who lost all income sources from fishing in the post-expansion time period, of which there were quite a few. So here are some conclusions that we can draw from these analyses. The main takeaways are, starting from the left, the greater number of fisher nodes with 1 or 0 income sources from fishing, the decreased edge density, or if you remember, edge density is a proxy for the connectivity of the network. So there was a decrease in the overall connectivity of the network. And then the consistent dependency on peacock bass among fishers. So the importance of peacock bass in the system, and the even sole reliance by some fishers on peacock bass for fish. So all of these things together, what do they mean? Could they mean decreased network resiliency? There's still the parameters for what makes a resilient or healthy, so to speak, social ecological network is debated in the literature since it's such a new network science. But according to a recent paper by Bassett et al. In 2021, yes, these changes in this network from this project do indicate decreased network resiliency. So some of the major themes contributing to this were a decrease in catch. So there was a widely reported, as I mentioned, decrease in catch per unit effort among the fishers interviewed. Almost 92%, over 90% of them reported a decrease in their catch per unit effort, and this could be attributable to a variety of factors. So perhaps a pandemic-induced influx of fishers. So this project was conducted in 2023. Just after the pandemic. So there was a jump in unemployment in the country. Maybe there was an influx of fishers to these communities looking for a different source of income. Because historically, fisheries in the lake have been completely open access, virtually no regulations on fishing, particularly artisanal fishing. So that could be a contributing factor, as well as potentially shifting trophic dynamics. Like I've mentioned several times, those are underdocumented. So it's hard to say, but clearly there were some shifting trophic dynamics going on in the system. And then there are several other proposed theories. The excavation of the canal, particularly intense dry season that year, as well as not recall bias, I'm forgetting exactly the term for it, but there's a term in sociology for the effect that looking into the past has. It's almost a nostalgia effect. So when people think of previous times, they think of those times as being better than current times often. That's a general trend that in sociology that people tend to follow. So that could also be a contributing factor. Another factor is the deterioration of fishing cooperatives in the system. So if you remember, I mentioned the loss of these social connections within the social realm from pre to post expansion. That can be attributed to the cooperatives that had previously existed in a couple major fishing communities around the lake. Those had been established in the 1980s and lasted until about the late 2000s and fell apart due to several infrastructure issues, as well as the inability of fishers to provide a consistent volume of catch for supermarkets in the nearby major cities. So supermarkets, corporate supermarkets, they want a consistent volume of catch. They want to know that demand is going or supply is going to meet the demand, and sometimes these small scale fishers just can't consistently provide the same amount of volume of catch. So this less connected network with less diverse income sources for fishers and decreased network resiliency leads to the need for increased monitoring of fisheries, bottom-up management, and self-organization strategies for fishers. So according to the Bassett et al. Paper from 2021 defining network resiliency, greater communication channels between actors within a network increase that network's adaptive capacity, or its capacity to withstand disturb the I can't think of the word at the moment, but things that disturb the network, such as climate change, a pandemic, for example, or the crash of a major fishery. Fishing cooperatives serve to create a communication channel between fishers and distributors. And it could be really beneficial for fishing communities to reestablish those channels, to organize themselves in such a way again, as well as to have those communication channels between themselves, between fishers. Another paper by Basurdo et al. From 2013 highlights the need for biological monitoring as a condition for self-organization. So as a precondition for allowing for self-organization among fishers. So all of these things together, increased monitoring of fish populations in the lake, self-organization among fishers so that they can diversify income sources and communicate between social actors, between buyers, between one another. All of those factors together would increase the resilience and adaptive capacity for the lake, the social ecological system of the lake. So just to speak a bit about future outlook and put this project into context, this was probably one of the first of its kind projects to apply a social ecological network study specifically to marine fish invasions. And there are some takeaways that I had from that experience. It's difficult to determine, using this framework, to determine exactly causality or chain of impacts. But in that regard, it's also advantageous to use a social ecological network framework in that you can get an overview of the system as a whole. And from that view, you can see points to for further investigation, for things to hypothesize. More ecosystem data would have allowed for a higher resolution model. So again, the need for biological monitoring system. And it also, the use of a social ecological network framework also highlighted the importance of using local ecological knowledge, fisher knowledge, and I think that's what makes social ecological sciences a unique tool, in that it's invaluable to use the information from people who are really living and utilizing and dependent on this ecosystem every day. And applications of this work for future study, like I discussed, there are a variety of factors that appear to be at play here. It's much more complicated than just the canal expansion, and fishers' income was reduced. There's a lot more things at play, a lot more things going on. And highly specialized fisher nodes are of more interest, are up for further investigation. As well as highly utilized ecological nodes such as peacock bass or now tilapia, because as we see in the network, since those are such, particularly peacock bass, that's a fish that's so heavily relied upon by so many people in the network, were that population to collapse, then it would be pretty disastrous for the network as a whole. And here's just a bibliography for the presentation. And thank you all very much for your attention.